Whoa. Good evening, everybody. Wow. It's like being on Broadway. Okay, so it's my privilege to introduce the last panel, but I should also mention there were supposed to be three of us. Mariana Mazzucato was the third. She woke up this morning with a pretty bad case of COVID, so she isn't with us, and so I'm going to play her. Actually, if any of you know her, there is no way I'm going to play her, but I am going to fill in some. So I have two roles here. So the first one is just to introduce the panel. And for those of you who are here this morning, I talked a little bit in setting this up about the idea of a political economy paradigm as something that structures politics within, and that changes over time. So at any given point in time, or many points in time, there'll be a kind of broadly shared political economy paradigm within which politics will take place. So there'll be a left and a right within it. It'll structure the disagreements. It really sets the framework for how political arguments go and for what is, in some sense, what's imaginable and what's not really imaginable in terms of ordinary politics. So if you think about it, what a paradigm does in that sense is it doesn't fully determine anything. Obviously, you can make arguments, and as I say, there are disagreements. It can go in different ways, but the terms of it will operate as a kind of heavy thumb on the scale in favor of some kinds of arguments and against others. So you can overcome it if it's in your favor, if there are strong enough considerations or the serendipities of the situation or the quality of the advocates or any number of things are there. And similarly, if what you're doing is against it, you can overcome it from time to time, which is why the world as it actually exists is always pretty messy. But the paradigm, nevertheless, is playing a really powerful gravitational force on the direction of politics. Now, these paradigms come in many forms and shapes. As I say, they change over time. Think about, comparing something like 18th and early 19th century mercantilism to mid-19th century laissez-faire to mid-20th century Keynesianism to, what we now think of as what has been the prevailing paradigm that is now failing, which is why we're here talking about alternatives, which is neoliberalism. So although they're very different, you can see them all as sharing, in a sense, essential parts that structure what they are. So I just want to kind of lay that out as a framework to think about what we're looking at when we think about it in an alternative. So first, there is typically kind of a description of society and the individual and their relationship to each other. It's a description, but it also has some kind of normative force. So if you think about neoliberalism, the kind of conception there is society consists of atomized, and I'm going to give a slightly caricatured version here, but just to make the point, it's atomized individuals competing to maximize their own utility, which is, on the value side, the definition of freedom. That becomes then the prevailing value for thinking about what neoliberals think of and understand as the structure and nature of society and what they want to do. At the other end, you typically have a goal, right? What you're trying to achieve through that approach to political economy. So again, if you think of neoliberals, the goal is basically growth. Growth, now it's come to be growth as measured by GDP. And that's why every year at the end, what we're looking at for comparison and becomes a huge force in structuring what our economic and political policies, foreign relations policies, all that, what it's going to be is built very much around that. There is, some space for redistribution within the neoliberal paradigm, but only as a very secondary thing at the back end, because if you have, too much of a maldistribution, you have to worry about social dissension and so on. But fundamentally, what you're looking for is growth, and you have to justify anything that is not essentially about that. And then in between, the third piece will be an approach to policy or a policy framework or a set of tools that, given the first thing, take you to the second. So if you believe that society consists of atomized individuals looking to maximize their own utility, and what you're trying to achieve is growth as measured by GDP, that kind of very particular conception of free markets begins to look rather attractive. Okay, so that's essentially the way one of these paradigms works. So if you have when these paradigms break down, when for one reason or another changes in society, the policies stop working, nobody believes in them anymore, whatever, as they break down, you get these periods of political disruption, such as we're experiencing now, such as we experienced when the Keynesian framework broke down before neoliberalism emerged in the 60s and 70s, such as we experienced in the 20s and 30s when the laissez-faire paradigm broke down and was replaced by Keynesianism. Here tonight, the idea, though, is in any event, as we think about the formation of a new paradigm, it can take many forms. And that's really the point I wanted to make, which is it can challenge any one or all three of those pieces, but involved some kind of reconfiguration. She was the faculty director of the Bauer McCoy Family Center for Ethics, which was a really substantive process of actually saving and building a really important institution within Stanford. She then served as a senior associate dean for humanities and arts, and since 2018 has been the dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences. Her areas of work include philosophy of economics and feminist philosophy. She's won numerous awards and is the author of numerous books and articles, including Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, The Moral Limits of Markets. And with that, Debra, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about, not surprisingly, the limits of markets, and in particular the need for democratic reasons to limit the scope of the market, because while markets do great things and arguably, contribute to the growth of the economy, and also, as Adam Smith noted, under certain conditions, they really support the freedom and equality of individuals, because I don't have to agree with you in order to cooperate with you, so they're very good mechanisms for bringing people together who don't agree. Under many conditions and in many domains, they actually undermine democratic institutions and democratic norms. And so I'm going to be talking about the reasons to actually push in on their scope. So they're fine in their place if well-designed, but their place has to be limited. And I'm going to start making this case that we need solidaristic institutions and policies. So markets are really great because they're individualizing. Again, I don't have to agree with you to cooperate, but in some circumstances, we really need not to individualize and differentiate, but to come together. And too much markets and too much inequality can prevent us from coming together and seeing ourselves and being, in fact, not just seeing ourselves, but being in the same boat. So I'm going to contrast, and it's a stylized contrast, and I'm going to idealize a little bit when I make this contrast, but I want to contrast two ways of distributing primary and secondary education. So imagine one way, which is a model where children are allocated to schools so that each school is a representative of the social and ethnic mix of the population. So we don't do that, and there are all kinds of impediments to doing that, but just imagine for a moment you could do that. That's one way you could distribute schooling, is you could say, okay, that's our principle for distributing schooling. Here's another way of distributing schooling. We distribute it in the form of individual choice, and we can use vouchers, we could use other mechanisms, and parents can use these vouchers at schools, whether public or private, that they most prefer. And this was something Milton Friedman famously argued, was that creating a voucher system would be superior to the public provision of education because it would actually create competition between schools, which could improve them. People could satisfy their preferences if they had different preferences, and so forth. I'm not going to argue about the efficiency gains. I want to talk about another feature of schools that are separated by, that are where distribution occurs by voucher or by choice versus the first model I was talking about, because I want to illustrate this point about solidarity. So we know in the United States, choice schools are more homogeneous than public schools. It's not that public schools are so heterogeneous, but they're more heterogeneous than choice schools with respect to class and race. And researchers have shown that when choice is available, educated parents are especially likely to factor child demographics into their choice of school. That can be because, and this is a feature of the kind of market education is, it's really hard to know how good schools are. And so people look for proxies. And one proxy is the class and race and the test scores, which are correlated with class and race of the student population. Now, even if we assume that the outcomes that arise from a voucher system satisfy parents' preferences as individual trustees for their own children, doesn't a democratic society have an interest in overcoming race and class divisions? Strong race and class divisions give rise to social instability, a lack of understanding, and help to maintain injustices. They lead to people not understanding the lives and conditions of others. But no individual parent can bring about goals such as ending race and class divisions on their own, independently of others. Now, it might be argued you could weight vouchers in such a way to take into account, give more weight to lower socioeconomic students. This might provide choice schools with an incentive to take some more of those students, but it doesn't guarantee social integration, which is a property of a school as a whole and not just the individual students who compose it. So one of the great virtues of a market economy is it allows people to sort and differentiate based on their preferences. The mere likings and dislikings of the majority are not a rule to me because I can opt for things on my own. At the same time, a democratic society arguably requires certain experiences and certain institutions where everyone is on an equal footing and everyone is treated the same. Standing in line to vote, for instance, also with respect to the rule of law, being served by public agencies, or serving on a jury. You might call this a point of forced solidarity. Common experiences can serve as a check on the tendency of the ultra-rich or the elites to exit from the general circumstances of the ordinary person. Curtailing this tendency is especially important for political decision-making, where political leaders often exempt themselves from the policies they impose on others, sending their children to private schools, for example, while cutting public educational spending. But the argument has implications beyond this point about political leaders. So data from California, where I live, suggests that, so we have a system where families can donate money to their own school, target it to supplement or to add to, by philanthropy, the amount that the state provides. And work by my colleague Susanna Loeb has shown that parental support for additional taxation for funding for schools for the entire state, for everyone, seems to go down when you could add to your own children's school because you have less of a stake in, you have a way of dealing with your own child and not dealing with the children of others. So I think there are a host of cases beyond education. So I think education is incredibly important because this idea of bringing people together from different walks of life so that they identify with each other and see each other as fellows and do it while they're very young is incredibly important. But it's not the only example that raises problems for democracy. So think of the role of money in elections in the United States. The chances for political influence shouldn't depend on a person's position in the distribution of income and wealth. Or think about markets in legal representation, where you can buy your way up, right, to fancy lawyers and get very different outcomes than people who are not able to afford lawyers. Or think about markets in news, or think about markets in national defense. In all of these cases, institutions that are supposed to serve everyone wind up serving only a few. And the bulk of people wind up thinking, because it's largely true, that the institutions have been captured. And they have a feeling that the system is rigged. I sometimes think back, so Milton Friedman played an important role in the United States in the decline, actually the abolition of a draft. And it's actually an interesting story about his influence here, and little did I think I'd be arguing for bringing back the draft. But it's actually the idea that we are all in this together. I look back at John F. Kennedy's PT boat, and you look at who was on that boat with him during World War II, and it was like the son of an auto mechanic and the son of a carpenter and somebody who grew up on a rural farm. And the idea that we're all in this together actually has social preconditions. And when people can sort in important social roles, it doesn't matter if you have a yacht and I don't. But it does matter if our legal system, you and I get very different outcomes simply because we're able to purchase different amounts of legal representation. So to close, I think it's really important to, when we think about the use of markets, to recognize two things. One is that markets need to be limited. So somewhere we need these common experiences. And also, not all markets are the same, right? So markets in education are quite different because actually the distribution of education affects our capacities and who we are in a way that the distribution of apples doesn't affect who we are and our capacities or how we relate to one another. And I'll close with that. Thank you.
Well, I just want to start by saying it's a privilege to follow Debra Satz, and I agree with every word you said. So now I'm going to try and build on it, and I'm going to start by picking up something I learned from Tim Besley a while ago, and Tim said, what we need is an integrated human sciences. Economics should take its humble part in that integrated human sciences. We don't have an integrated human sciences, and it will be the project of the next century, or at least the rest of this century, to build that integrated human sciences. We need it now, and we don't have it. So what can we do which is seriously second best, but at least moves us forward? And the approach I've taken is to narrow the problem drastically. So I'm going to take one very limited dimension of the general problem that you sketched. And I would love to take education because I agree so radically with you. But I'm instead going to take one aspect of life chances, which is differences in opportunities between communities of place. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And Tim laid out for all of us a very beautifully set out sequence of analysis. We've all got to start with a normative account of the individual in society. So let me do that. And my guide here is Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel, who, could I just ask, who here is familiar with the work of Michael Sandel? Michael Sandel is, in my view, by far the most influential moral philosopher, living moral philosopher, because he's done marvelous series of edX lectures, which have been followed by about 30 million well-educated young people from around the world. It's very age-specific, Michael Sandel's audience. There are very few people over the age of about early 30s, right? So it was notable that almost nobody mentioned Michael Sandel or his philosophy earlier in the day, when the average age of the audience was, shall we say, almost as high as mine. But I work closely with Michael Sandel, and so that's the moral philosophy I'll be building on. And his concept is contributive justice. And contributive justice, just to remind those of you who know about it and try and explain it in a very short way to people who don't, contributive justice says in a society you have some duty to contribute to common purposes. You can't just say, well, I'm part of the society, but I'm just going to maximize my own self-interest. That's not a legitimate thing to do if you're a member of a society, a member of a community. You should contribute to common purposes, conditional upon. Conditional upon what? Conditional upon, first, that, and I'll be dealing with communities of place, right? That your community is given equal respect with other communities. So I'll be looking at communities of place which have fallen behind, which are left behind. They're communities of place in America. Think of the derogatory term flyover cities. Get worse than flyover cities, but we'll start with flyover cities. Right? It's a pejorative term, isn't it? Flyover cities. So they're the sort of communities of place that feel a bit left behind. In Britain, you've got the same. You've got, I mean, somebody spoke a little bit about levelling up. Levelling up, of course, in Britain was entirely about the vast discrepancies which have opened up between the regions of England outside London in the southeast and London in the southeast. And that has got acutely worse over the last 40 years, acutely worse. And we'll be looking at that sort of spatial inequality. So there needs to be equality of respect between communities. There needs to be, I'll give you one phrase which captures the disdain of London for the other regions of England. And it's a quote from an article by Janan Ganesh, who is an archetypical London representative. He said, it feels, being in London and stuck with these wretched regions, it feels like being shackled to a corpse. I grew up in what he calls the corpse. These are pejorative, dismissive terms, right? They're not equality of respect. So we don't, in Britain, have equality of respect between places, and we don't have it in America. Next, equality of voice. Equality of voice. If you're going to agree to common purposes, you need to have a reasonable equality of voice. Is there equality of voice in America between the flyover cities and everywhere and the rich coasts? No. Right? Is there equality of voice approximately in England between the regions that are left behind and London and the South East, my God, no. Right? So we haven't got equality of respect, we haven't got equality of voice. And a final condition that Michael Sandel sets out is you have to have sufficient economic opportunities so that your material position is you're in a position to be able to contribute to the whole. That doesn't mean you've got to have the same income as everybody else. You've got to have at least enough not to be on the breadline so that you can contribute. Right? I'll give you one example of that in action. It was, over 100 years ago, it was the founding of the University of Sheffield. I grew up in Sheffield, perhaps now the poorest city in the whole of England. Right? So Sheffield University was founded in 1904, and it was a collaborative effort between the biggest industrialist in Sheffield, a firm called Firth. So Firth said, I will put up half the money, anything that the workers, the steel workers, contribute, I'll match. And then the trades unions, the steel trades unions, said we will do a voluntary levy on all our workers, our steel workers, of a week's wages. And everybody contributed. Well, that was a voluntary levy. Everybody, out of a sense of solidarity, contributed. And so there was a huge surge of contributions from employees, from wage earners, and from the main business owner, the steel baron. Why were the steel workers willing and able to contribute? Because the steel baron had paid the steel workers a decent living wage. You didn't drive them down to the rock bottom wage he could get away with. He was part of the community, and he saw a sense of duty towards his workforce. So that was the founding of Sheffield University. And why did they both choose to found a university and not build a cathedral, which is what they'd have done in the Middle Ages? Because they got the correct sense that education, which they themselves, the steel workers, didn't have, many of them had barely been to school, but they got this sense that education was the future. And who would be their beneficiaries? It would be their children and their grandchildren that would grow up educated in Sheffield. Right? Who benefited from that? Me. Right? My parents both left school when they were 12. Right? I wasn't always fancy Professor Sir. Right? But I was the beneficiary of that. And shamefully, what I used it for was to get out, become a professor at Oxford and at Harvard, Sciences Po in Paris, and all the rest of it. I've done very well out of Sheffield, thank you very much. But I walked away. Right? And part of me tells myself that was shameful. So I've tried to compensate, I've tried to remedy by working with the Sheffield's community and the Sheffield political organisations, the council. I was very proud last month. I was invited by the Sheffield Council to be the guest of honour at the main event that Sheffield has in the whole world, why it's now on the media map. Anybody know what it was? Snooker. Snooker. Right? Sheffield for 50 years has been the world capital of the snooker competition, the World Snooker Competition. So that's the good news. I've been playing snooker since I was a kid. Right? And it was a magnificent event. Right? I was really proud to be guest of honour there. It was going to be last year that it's held in Sheffield. Why? Because some very clever lawyers doubtless from extremely good universities, have discovered that you can detach the rights to holding the event from the fact that for the last 50 years it's been in Sheffield. And so next year, guess where it will be held? Riyadh. Yes, it was put up to the highest bidder by these clever lawyers. Right? So it's going to be in Riyadh. And that is a little micro-example of the tension between a very clever meritocratic lawyer. Sorry. I'll say all that again. So that is the tension between a very clever meritocratic lawyer who has done something that's extremely good for the lawyer, right? But there's here a very clear tension between the interest of the community and the personal interests of that lawyer. Right? Now, the lawyer might well take a lot of pride in her skill in detaching those rights from Sheffield. Right? That's the tension between meritocracy and community. It's not, in this case, that meritocracy maximizes income. It doesn't. Right? It maximizes the income of the lawyer at the expense of society. Right, so I better get on. So, if any of these conditions, equality of voice, equality of respect, equality of ability to contribute, if any of them are breached, then they become a priority in Tim's next category. So he started with moral norms. I've told you my moral norms. Michael Sandel, contributive justice. Now we turn to goals. Goals. So any of these conditions are breached, and in Britain and America they're all breached, they become part of the priority goals that you have to fix. You have to get to at least some degree of equality of voice, at least some degree of equality of respect. And the goal I'm going to set has a fancy name. It's called inclusive prosperity. Right? What do I mean by that? I mean that within the society, life chances are as equal as possible, subject to ensuring mass prosperity. Now, I say mass prosperity. What do I mean by that? I do not mean rules. I do not mean rules. Rules wanted to maximize the minimum, the income of the poorest person in the society. Right? No society, none, has bought into the Rawlsian project. And remember, one of the slides we had earlier, the default option, certainly for economics, is the wretchedness of utilitarianism, right? So whatever we want, we don't want to retreat into utilitarianism, I think. So what does Sandel argue? What are we trying to maximize with mass prosperity? Not the Rawlsian income of the poorest, the income of the median. The income of the median. Right? Not the mean. That's what America does. Right? California, mean income is very high. Mean income in California, probably the highest in the world. Right? Median income in California isn't the highest in the world because so much of that income is captured by a few rich. Right? So, median income is what we're going to be trying to maximize. Why is that? Because it's consistent with, first of all, with evolutionary biology. Secondly, it's consistent with political reality, that if you maximize the income of the median, you've already got a political majority. It's feasible to get a majority. political feasibility is awfully important if you're going to have a democracy. And if you don't have a democracy, heaven help you, right? So that's what I mean by mass prosperity, not Rawlsian, Sandelian, right? The median. In the context of Britain and the USA, I'll be focusing on communities of place, e.g. regions and cities, right? Neither America nor Britain has achieved anything close to equalities of life chances between regions and anything like equality of life chances between cities. So this goal becomes the objective for public policy. That then becomes the goal. And now I turn to the third category of Tim, which is a set of policies that achieve that objective given our moral norms. Sandelian moral norms, contributive justice. Now we're going to achieve that by a strategy. Right? And although neither the USA nor Britain's achieved spatial equality of the life chances, they failed for very different reasons. So you can fail in many different ways. The USA has predominantly failed because it's got a private sector plutocracy which has achieved exceptional spatial so they've got an exceptionally wealthy plutocracy which has got far too much political influence. To come close in America to $1, one vote. And so the rich have used that for their own priorities. Now, not all the rich are on the right. You've also got a lot of billionaires on the left. The billionaires on the right want a very conventional agenda of greedy billionaires, which is tax cuts. But the billionaires on the left, on the New York, on the West Coast, they've got their priorities, but very different. They don't want tax cuts, so they're not greedy, but their priorities are not coincident with the places that are left behind. And so the flyover cities they're not part of the agenda. So left behind places are not of interest to the billionaires of the political left. So that's, I think, America. Its fundamental problem is plutocracy and the excessive political voice of the rich, both on the right and on the left. The USA, that's one thing. The Britain is a very different problem. It's the same failure. We haven't got anything like equality of respect and all the rest of it between left behind places and successful places. But the diagnosis now is of a bureaucracy which is exceptional in three respects. And it's this killer combination of three respects of the British bureaucracy which is so disastrous. One is it's massively over-centralized in the Treasury. Massively. The Treasury has completely a degree of power which is off the map exceptional compared to any other bureaucracy anywhere in the world. So it's exceptionally over-centralized. It's exceptionally short-termist because the business of the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, is to square the annual budget. We do not have a counterweight of a Ministry of Economy or anything like that, which is a voice for the future. I'll say all that again. Right, so exceptionally over-centralized, exceptionally short-termist. There is no counterweight to this annual struggle for the budget, and exceptionally overconfident. And that combination is a killer, because the overconfidence of the Treasury, the overconfidence of the Treasury, I enjoy saying that phrase somehow. The overconfidence of the Treasury has led to it being dismissive of any process of learning from failure. By God, it's had a lot of failure, right? We have got the widest spatial discrepancies in Europe, and indeed they're even wider than in America. So we've got exceptional spatial inequalities between left-behind places and successful places. Basically, every region out in England, and the domain of the Treasury has shrunk to England, because for different reasons, Scotland managed to run off, Wales managed to run off, and Northern Ireland run off. So the Treasury's domain has shrunk from, it used to run half the world, and now it's running the English regions. So that's what we've got, I'm afraid. It doesn't have to be like that, because other societies have achieved inclusive prosperity. We simply need to learn from them. But the Treasury is so overconfident that it refuses to look and learn from anywhere else. So I'll give you one example. Denmark has the most equal life chances in the OECD. It also has a highly innovative enterprises. You may have come across Novo Nordisk, pharmaceutical company. Novo Nordisk is more profitable at the moment than any two of the Silicon Valley Super 7. So if you want profits, Novo Nordisk is more profitable than any of these Amazons, Googles, blah, right? Microsoft, have you. It's more profitable, but it's also more pro-social, because Novo Nordisk is a foundation. That is, the profits accrue to a foundation, and beneath that is a corporate law which is encouraging in Denmark and has been used to create these companies which have foundations. Lego is not so very different. Right? These are pro-social companies, hugely successful, hugely innovative. The average Californian, remember, the highest per capita income society in the world, blah, blah, the average Californian will be better off in Denmark. Right? And that I've done all the calculations for, and it is true, right? The median voter in California should move to Denmark. Right? So why have we got this persistence of a belief in America? Remember, it's the exaggerated political influence of the rich, and in Britain, it's the exaggerated confidence over centralization of the Treasury. Right? On that note, I can actually do a little I was discouraged by my publishers from mentioning this, but I breached my publishers insistence. All of this is written up in a book that will coming out in 2 weeks, and it's called Left Behind. I'll be back in the LSE on June the 13th for the Festival Ideas. So if anybody comes to the Festival Ideas, you can hear all this again, plus more. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much.
So thank you. I want to try and kind of wrap this up and also put the two talks we had in context a little bit in the context of what we're talking about here. So the thing about take neoliberalism as a paradigm is its comprehensiveness, right? And they are intellectual ideas, but they're not just that. They have to operate within politics to structure and shape what comes out of politics. So the interesting thing about it is you can have a very rich, detailed political economic philosophy that you use to generate solutions, but it also needs to work on an intuitive level for ordinary voters. When I was doing research on neoliberalism, one of the things that really struck me was Milton Friedman used to actually go on the Johnny Carson show all the time. And he was brilliant at explaining the heart of what was, in fact, a lot of complex policy in ways that just you would get as an ordinary citizen without anything. And that becomes, very important as you think about it, because it's what makes these things stick and what makes it possible to do so. But the comprehensiveness is the way it then works through all policy. So Debra talked about education policy, and if you think about it, the neoliberal frame has structured the way we have approached education policy for at least a generation. So the idea was we need to think of schools as a market. And if we have problems in our schools and the kids aren't learning as much as they need to and the results are too low, we need to restructure the incentives and then it will take care of itself. So we should create consumer choice that becomes vouchers and charter schools. We need greater accountability, so we need to punish teachers if they're not getting the right results and let everything else take care of itself. And of course, it's been an utter failure because schools don't actually work that way and they're not actually market actors in that way. But it sort of, people believe, there's still actually quite a few people who believe this deep, deep in their heart, and if it doesn't seem to be working, it's because we haven't gone far enough. And that's the strength, that's the power that these intellectual paradigms have. So, as I say, I think it's pretty easy to look at the world today and see that the neoliberal paradigm is failing. It's increasingly, people are disillusioned with what it has produced, the elite institutions through which it was embodied, people have consistently lost faith in. But what is an alternative? And more importantly, what would it take to know that we have one? And that itself is, an interesting part of the problem because of the way, as I say, it's not just some single philosophy or approach. In fact, you'll never get kind of complete alignment around that. It's always going to be somewhat looser than that. And it's not something that's kind of just announced. And in fact, often it's only apparent in hindsight that we've actually stumbled into one, right? So sometimes these paradigms are captured in a book or, something that really, begins a movement. Hayek's Road to Serfdom being probably the classic obvious example. He didn't publish it and boom, the world became neoliberals, but it really took for a lot of people who didn't fully agree with all of it, but it became a kind of point around which a whole movement could develop, not just an intellectual one. Funders followed, media followed, all sorts of political actors began to build off of it. So it became Keynes's general theory, not quite as effective. If you've ever tried to read it, you know why. But it just illustrates sort of how these things begin and generate, and there's a kind of growing acceptance of family ideas, with adherents in the academy, in politics, in media, and then at some point, it has established itself. But it's hard to know exactly where that point is. And that is to say, it's harder to capture a kind of growing consensus. And still, we need the ideas. Right? We need them around which people can kind of rally and around which a consensus. I will say one of the things that also helps is a name, which this movement does not have. I mentioned this morning neoliberals called themselves neoliberals at first, and then later changed that to calling themselves capitalists, and sort of people bought into it so that version became what a lot of people today think is capitalism. But they had something around. When you think about intellectual movements across disciplines, in law, originalism, has a meaning, and people know if they're originalists or not, even though a lot of them disagree on all sorts of different things. I mention that because I think both from these talks and probably other things you're hearing around, things you heard in this conference, there is an emerging set of ideas, some of which pick up strands from older thoughts, some of which are new, but there is kind of the beginnings, I think you can spot it, of an emerging new paradigm. We have a ways to go. And again, bear in mind, by the way, that any description of a paradigm in this way will, from an intellectual perspective or academic perspective, appear overly simplistic or misleading. So I will say that now up front. Danny Roderick, when we started the work on new paradigms, the economy and society work, Danny Roderick published a piece. It's a beware of economists bearing paradigms. And then he made the point, like any of these, that's not the way any actual economist thinks about things. It's way more complicated than that. And we got into it. I ended up giving him a $15 million grant because the idea, this is when I was at Hewlett. So this was, the idea was, as a straight intellectual matter, of course you're right. But even the economists who know that, when they go out into politics, and they do, present a much more simplified frame. And the politicians who are kind of doing the work to translate your policy ideas into something that will be enacted politically do so as well. So there is an identifiable paradigm, even if when you get down to kind of the brass tacks of particular policies, there's a lot of variation within it. So it's important to know that as you think about what is a kind of emerging new set of ideas, it's around which we could have that kind of political mobilization. So take the three pieces that I talked about. Debra kind of talked about a different aspect of the first one, right? Instead of thinking about methodological individualism, we need to think about solidarity as a way to describe what people are, the way society works, the way things work. And I think you see that more broadly. So the neoliberal notion of atomized individuals, with freedom being the primary value, is we're not going back there. The kind of 60s, 70s liberal version in which there was social forces that were shaping everything. It wasn't really about the individual, and equality was the key value. We're not going back there either. What's beginning to emerge is something that's a little more synthetic of the two, where we recognize that, of course, we're individuals, but as individuals, we define ourselves through our identity as members of groups or communities. In fact, most of us are members of multiple communities, and those communities do somewhat compete, but also we're not just in it for ourselves, right? We also want all the other people in our communities to do well as well. And so there's a kind of, I'm just going to borrow language that I got from Eric Beinhocker, who was here earlier, but I think you hear more of it. It's the idea of mutualism, right? And so we as members of society are members of communities or groups. We have a commitment to mutualism, which takes us towards collaboration and cooperation as much as it does competition, although all three of them are part of what we do. Now, at the other end, if you think about the goals side, I think it's somewhat easier to see where we're going. And if you look out there, I think I see three distinct strands that are emerging. Paul talked about one of those, right? Because the first one is we need somehow not to think about growth, which is the neoliberal version of it, but we need to think about a more justly distributed growth or inclusive prosperity. And that's a really important goal, and that's going to and that makes sense if we start from a notion of mutualism, that actually that is what our communities want. We still have to figure out how to get there. That's the third piece. We'll come back to that. But it's also not all that I think you see emerging. I think you also see, and they're related, a second strand which focuses around a substantive notion of opportunity. So neoliberals love to talk about opportunity, but for them, opportunity means government isn't in your way. We're not going to bother taking into account different starting positions that people might have that make it grotesquely unfair or unequal. So a different idea is actually, if we are going to have, as I think we are, a commitment to an economic system, I'm not going to use the word capitalism, but in which most of the economic activity is still based on private enterprise, then we need to put people in a position, because that has all sorts of benefits. It generates lots of innovation. It can generate, in fact, a lot of growth. It's not like growth is a bad thing. But we need to make sure that people have the substantive tools they need to get the fruits of that. So that, obvious things, education, healthcare, housing, the basic necessaries of life, those become essential for society to provide, still putting off on the side, bracketing the question whether that's from government, from the private sector, from both. We have to figure out how to do it, but it becomes so we have a goal of a justly distributed wealth in a society in which people have a substantive opportunity to gain the benefits of participating in a private enterprise system. And then there's a third strand which isn't yet well integrated into it, which is even all that is sort of thinking too narrowly about what people are and what they want. So it's not just about their material well-being. There are also broader notions of well-being. Paul Laird is working on this, that we need to think about in terms of what we're trying to achieve through our policies. Now, as I say, none of this is settled, but this is, I think, what's emerging as a genuinely alternative way of thinking about political economy to what neoliberalism has been. Then the third piece, of course, is what's the policy framework or approach to policy that would take us from the first thing to the second thing. And that's where most of the work is and has been. And of course, there's a ton of work in there, right? I should say most of it is done without thinking about those connections to a conception of society or core values, or without thinking about what the ultimate goal of society is. Not that it's not there, it's just often left implicit. But you can think of the work of the people on this panel as contributing that. Kate Raworth's, what is it, donut economics. There's a ton. I think one of the things that I've been very attracted to is Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker have this notion of pre-distribution, where what we need to think about is structuring our markets at the front end. So yes, they still generate growth, but they do it in a way that will produce a more just distribution at the back end. So that'll take us to a different labor law and a different antitrust law, a different corporate law, and so on. And then there's a ton of new approaches to policy in particular areas, right? Tons of new thinking around antitrust, corporate law, labor law, monetary policy, trade, foreign relations, industrial policy. It's all out there. So what we're missing and what we still need is a synthesis, right? There's all that stuff is out there, but for this to actually gel into something that can actually replace neoliberalism, or better still, replace the ethno-nationalism, which is what is actually taking root in most places as neoliberalism fades, is some way to see how all of those things across hang together into the kind of story that Milton Friedman could tell on the Johnny Carson show that would persuade people. So with that, I think we'll just go straight to the audience and take your questions to any of the panelists. Okay, so just raise your hand, and we have are we using mics? Yes, so of course the first person's in the middle. Well, you'll get the mic, because there's people online.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much. Really fascinating. You just very briefly touched on it right at the end there, Larry, about the paradigm competition between neoliberalism and mutualism, but then the populist backlash that we're seeing. So I wondered if, Sir Paul talked about the left behind areas, and we're seeing that in the UK and the US, but globally, where the failures of neoliberalism are leading to this populist backlash. So how do you balance the intellectual argument in both directions against the classical neoliberals and against the rise of populism?
Paul, do you want to start?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we've got the rise of mavericks who Trump, Boris, Modi, Zuma. And why have they been given this opportunity? Because in each of their societies, there was people left in humiliation who shouldn't have been left in humiliation. And so who's to blame for it? It's the failures over several decades that have left people who should have been included in mass prosperity, have been left feeling humiliated, and therefore the humiliated are prone to hear the siren calls of some completely bogus but clever communicator. Trump, Bond, Modi, Zuma, they're all clever communicators peddling false strategies. And the poor, the humiliated, reach for them as a drowning man reaches in desperation for a lifeboat. So who's to blame? It's the 40 years of neglect by the successful communities of these places that have slipped further and further into humiliation. It is totally avoidable, has been avoided in successful societies around the world. We are a very pro-social mammal. We are the most pro-social of all mammals. We have evolved to be pro-social. We can be dragged down by humiliation. We can, of course, be dragged down by greed. That's simple, right? But we had the communities of the rich dragged down by the temptations of greed, the communities of the poor being dragged down by humiliation to be there, easy pickings for the mavericks. And it doesn't have to be like that. Right? We can run societies in such a way that there aren't humiliated people. We've got plenty of societies around the world like that.
So the one thing I agree about the humiliation, and the one thing I would add is we've had a long period of institutions that were really meant to serve the whole population equally, only working for some. Yeah. And that's very visible to people. And so a lot of what you're seeing is people they don't believe in institutions, they don't believe in the status quo, and they just want to wreck it. And you have to offer them an alternative.
A collapse in trust in government.
I want to actually make a slightly different point, which is when you think about these kinds of shifts that take place, the question is, how does it happen? There was a long period of time when, because the societies were so undemocratic, whether they called themselves democratic or not, and you had an elite that, although it had divisions, roughly went along with each other, you could just have a shift in thinking at the elite level and it would produce that shift. That actually began to change in the post-World War I era. So the interesting thing about neoliberalism is it was absolutely a carefully calculated, funded political effort that included support for the development of ideas. I think I mentioned, it started in Europe because prior to World War II, Europe was the intellectual center of the Western world. By the 1950s, that had clearly shifted to the US, and the leaders within that movement, I found letters they're discussing, we need a base in the US. Should we make it the University of Chicago or Princeton? And they settled on the University of Chicago. And then they went and funded a position, Hayek couldn't get an appointment, they built a center for him. Coase couldn't get an appointment in the economics department, they got him in the law school, because law schools will take anybody. And so on, and that was the ideas piece, but at the same time, they made efforts to capture popular media. They did. In the 1950s, they went for talk radio, which they still hold today, funded Ronald Reagan on a TV show. They went for religious groups. It took them a lot longer to turn those around, but the moral majority did. So all of this was a kind of concerted effort along all fronts. And for better or worse, they recognized that you needed to do that, and it's going to require that kind of effort. Now, no single actor can play all those parts. The job for us at the universities is, I hope, to develop the ideas that can begin to address. And the weird thing about it is it's not a left-right political movement, because the other thing about these changes is they always are accompanied by a realignment. What is left and what is right changes from what it was before and after. So as long as we stay stuck in kind of 20th century categories of left and right, we're not going to make progress. It's really recognizing that we need to rethink this. And that's happening on the right as well as the left.
Thank you, professors, for a lovely talk. I actually wanted to talk about exactly what you just ended on, is the alternative that we need to the neoliberal story, a new economic story, perhaps. What do you consider to be the most critical and productive channels, communication channels today that can help us get there? So perhaps we don't need to wait for a synthesis of these ideas, but we can start pushing them through certain channels, be that internet memes or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's such a great question. I mean, because one of the neat things about neoliberals is how they did it, right? They published this boulderized version of Road to Serfdom in Reader's Digest, and then circulated to a vast audience, and this is the US story. And they actually captured the Saturday Evening Post, which probably very few people here, I remember it from when I was a little kid. And they built think tanks, and they did all of that.
And Milton Friedman was a great
And Milton Friedman, he was. It's so much harder today because the communication channels are so fragmented, there's so much noise, there's not those same shared audiences. So I don't know that there's an easy answer that we figured out yet. I think you have to move along all fronts, but obviously the internet and social media are going to be at the center of it, particularly for younger people. I mean, I have a 23-year-old daughter. I don't think she's ever read a newspaper, but she keeps up on she actually does know what's going on, but her channels are through social media.
Yeah. Can I just build on that? Social media, who knows how to navigate social media? It's young people. It's people like you not people like me, right? Why do I come to events like this, talk to all of you who are under 30, basically, right? Because you know how to navigate social media, right? And you're clever. The clever young have a duty of communication in social media. I can't do it. Right? You can. And so you have a moral duty to fight in social media to spread truth rather than the rubbish that is on social media. Right? So that's why I come to events like this, to tell you lot you've got a moral duty. Right? And you can duck it, but if you duck it, you can't feel sorry about your future, which will be shit.
So I want to.
We're all applauding a shit future.
I want to add one thing here, which to me is, it's about the solidarity point again. So I actually think we have a more challenging world because we don't have shared information and shared social media. So I grew up, there was like a filter on the news. It definitely ruled things out, and some things that probably shouldn't have been ruled out, but people had a common set of facts, and we're living in a world where it's not just that you get your own values, but you get your own facts, and that makes it much harder to develop a narrative that is widely shared. And I don't know how to roll that back, but it's a huge challenge.
So we'll take a question online.
So yeah, to synthesize a few questions, you spoke about this new emerging paradigm. Perhaps you could talk a bit more about how that emergence occurs, what the process of emergence looks like. Is that natural? Is it an artificial process imposed from above? And secondly, drawing on another question, that emergence isn't into a vacuum. As you said earlier today, this paradigm is emerging in a period of immense flux. Could you sketch perhaps what you see as the biggest challenges this new paradigm will have to face, perhaps the challenges which will come to define it more concretely?
So it's neither something that is dictated from above nor something that happens quite naturally, right? It actually requires movement on all fronts by all sorts of different actors. As we thought about this, again, I'll just talk about it as a funder, because we have no idea what will take or what will work. So we started with an approach that was sort of, we're just going to fund all sorts of ideas that look like they might take and then see what takes. And you know, the biggest and most effective thing, which you will eventually need, is political leadership that buys into it. So again, it was the election of Reagan, the election of Thatcher in 79 and 80 that kind of sealed neoliberalism as the new prevailing paradigm, although it took another few years for the left to flip and embrace it. So you got, you know, the left-wing version of progressive neoliberalism in Blair and Clinton. And it was political leadership. One of the interesting things that happened with Biden's election was they took a whole lot of people from a whole lot of the organizations that have been working on this and brought them into the administration. And all of those Bidenomics policies, which are one version of this, were crafted by those people. And if those policies stick, and if they work, and if there is sufficient effort to persuade people that they are working, because you know, the media problem is a lot of people whose lives are pretty good still believe their lives are terrible, then maybe something begins to develop. The thing about this, though, is there's no guarantees that it goes in a good direction. Think about the 20s. As I said this morning, a lot of people did become fascists. A lot of people did become communists. There was ethno-nationalism, which is an alternative when people feel their lives aren't working and the institutions that are supposed to help them are failing them. They'll turn to something that seems better, and you know, we could end up in that direction. That would be a very bad place to end up, but there's no guarantee. So it's all kind of historically contingent, and all we can do is all of us do the best that we can to try and push better ideas. In addition to young people in social media, I would say The other important thing is training that people get at universities. It's not, I'd love to believe that the scholarship I write is what's going to change the world, but if anything does, it's more likely, if I'm lucky, the students I teach will go out and do things. And I think faculty sort of need to recognize that as really an important role that universities play. So, yeah.
What about a global Green New Deal as an alternative paradigm?
Anybody want to talk? Do you want to take that? Or do you?
None of us want to take that one. Why do I not want to take it? I think the more... So if you followed what I was saying, devolve. A very useful principle is subsidiarity. You devolve to the lowest level at which an objective can be achieved. Yeah? And that will vary depending on what the objectives are. If the objective is to get rid of loneliness amongst the young and the old, those are the two groups, certainly in British society, there's an epidemic of loneliness amongst people of my age and amongst teenagers. Right? We do not need a national ministry of loneliness to tackle that. We need to devolve to the level of very local, so that people learn who's lonely in our street. Right? So always you devolve to the lowest level at which an objective can be achieved. You don't do the opposite and try and elevate it to the highest level, which is the global. We can glibly talk about a global community, but just look at it, right? Look at the geopolitical divisions, look at the enormous normative differences. And so it's just, I think, the less we rely upon, in any sense, a global community, the better, because where is the agreement between China, India, America? Where's the agreement, right? I mean, this is the desperate realities of, if we go back in history, there were times when there was a scope for a lot of coming together at the international community level. 1989, 1990, that was such a period where there seemed to be, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that sort of thing, a coming together. That moment is long past. We didn't make a good job of building a global community then, and we will pay a very bitter price. That was my age group that bequeathed you, young people, a mess, right? My age group has nothing to brag about. But you have inherited this very difficult world, and I suspect it'll be there for another 50 years.
Yeah, so, I did a commencement speech at Koç University in Istanbul at one point, and there was a line in the speech about, I apologized to them for what our generation had done, and actually they stopped and I got a standing ovation at that point, and nobody liked the rest of the speech, but that line. What I would say, again, part of it is understanding what we mean by a paradigm. So a global New Deal, whether it's a single global policy around addressing climate or devolved into many different national policies that address it because there's broad acceptance, either one is still part of a paradigm. The New Deal itself was not a paradigm, it was an expression, but you need all of these other pieces, and then it makes something like that politically thinkable and enactable. So what I think there's no question is any new paradigm does need to take into account the problem essentially of sustainability. That is to say, we don't just need economic policies that can deliver for people, but we need them to deliver in ways that now take into account limitations on natural resources that we used to, and ecology that we used to think we didn't have to worry about. One of the downsides of neoliberalism is the assumption of perpetual growth as if there's no limitations on it. We still have to figure out ways to generate growth for people, but we have to do it within limitations, climate being the most powerful one. And as a result, I think in the emerging debates, one of the most powerful anchors around which new policies and new ways of thinking about economic regulation are developed. It's not a coincidence that the Biden administration's centerpiece, the IRA, which is a new industrial policy, is fundamentally climate policy. And that's because of that. So
Larry, one thing on your, you have to have the theory first and the paradigm before you have the policy. I wonder if that's always true, and if sometimes an emblematic policy gets people to think in a new way about something that they hadn't thought about before.
yeah, I don't think of it as, it's not linear, it's more you're tacking back and forth. So
Right.
new policies that sell can help you rethink how you were thinking about the nature of society or what your goals are and vice versa. So it's always a tacking back and forth.
And I come back to one point, which is that the right, the plundering plutocracy in America rests upon lies. It's a very unstable alliance between people who are voting for mavericks because they believe the mavericks, and the mavericks are offering basically lies. This is the Trumps, the Modis, etc. Their political alliance between the humiliated and the rich is an unstable alliance because it rests upon continuing lies. And so the truth is a powerful weapon against them. Remember, we are naturally pro-social, and so we can build a community level response that is much more popular and doesn't rest upon falsehoods. It can give credible hope. That's what I mean by inclusive prosperity. It's a credible prospect of hope instead of an incredible prospect of hope. But if you just offer despair, you've lost.
Wait for the microphone for people online.
Hi, Debra. I was wondering what role do you think that new forms of data stewardship can play in sort of achieving the solidarity that you're discussing is necessary? And I guess maybe a further on to that question is, I mean, a lot of the things that you've spoken about today is sort of community in its sort of the geographic relativity of community. And I guess I wonder how significant that is, and whether the solutions that you're looking for will exist in regenerating those lost spaces or those cities, the flyover cities, or actually whether the answer exists in data, and how we utilize that to have a sense of solidarity and shared community and targets.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say I'm a skeptic that data and online things can replace contact. I actually think one of the most robust pieces of social science we have is the contact hypothesis, that actually meeting people face to face and spending some time with them is the best dissolver of lack of understanding, indifference, hatred. Doesn't always work, obviously, but, and so I'd love to think about more ways to do this without bringing people together, but I wonder if in the end, you're really going to be able to substitute for getting people together, which is why, again, the military, or just think about national service, required national service, that actually forces people to spend time listening to each other and without the ability to turn off. There may not be a good substitute for that.
Can I follow up?
Detach national service from anything to do with the military.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. If it was linked to helping deprived areas, and it's very clear, what the deprived areas are, if it was linked to service in deprived areas, then that would be a very different kettle of fish. So I think that, and I so agree. My kids have got, I forget how many hundreds of friends on social media. The reality is they're very lonely. Right? Your friends on social media are not friends. They're not going to help you when you're down. They're not people you can count on. To get people who care for you, you need to have made eye contact and be in the same place with them for a long time.
My name is Pranab Bardhan from Berkeley. Since my comment is really addressed to Debra, since Debra knows that I agree with most of what she said, solidarity versus neoliberalism, although I should say different people mean different things by neoliberalism. So I actually avoid that term for that reason. But listening to all of you, most of which I agree to, the contrarian in me comes up. And let me give you an example from non-Western societies. Non-Western societies quite often have solidarities, solidaristic groups. And quite often, those solidaristic groups are quite oppressive. And some of them would like to have one essential feature of what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism, one of the essential features is competition, anonymity. Anonymity. And if you would grow up in those oppressive solidaristic groups, sometimes you hanker for anonymity, hanker for competition. So that's what the contrarian in me tells me, that most of the time we have been talking of Western societies where overemphasis on individualism, but there's also this opposite in large parts of the world, including the society in India that I come from. Communities and solidaristic groups can be quite oppressive.
So Pranab, I completely agree that the solidarity argument is not meant to take all the space, and it's definitely not meant to substitute for free and equal. And free and equal actually markets and individuation supports free and equal up to a point. So I think in their place, exit is, in its place, really important. It's just that there are some contexts in which just catering to exit doesn't get you the kind of social institutions that you need for a democratic society.
So completely agree that, but I would say, without some sense of community, communities are like glue. Without any sense of community, you're really, I think, in trouble. But community is not enough. You need not just community, but communities in a common society that works together. And community plus society isn't enough. You then need bounds that prevent that society from being predatory upon others. So there's got to be very clear limits to that and moral norms that say you can't do that, right? Because otherwise we get fascism. So fully agree with you. Bangladesh, I think, is an interesting case where you've got a very active economy that's grown not thanks to government, not thanks to politicians. The politicians in Bangladesh have been an embarrassment. But you've had very active social movements, BRAC, Yunus, and the social movements have transformed the society together with the market economy, which brought in the garments industry, which enormously gave an exit option for young women instead of just going and being the servant of the mother-in-law. And so that exit option has produced a lot of liberation of young women, albeit in not very good jobs, but a great deal better. They've got an exit option.
So I want to offer a slightly different answer. obviously also agree it'd be impossible to disagree with it, although it also has been true of the West. I mean, people in the West spent 400 years killing each other over whether they were Catholics or Protestants. So to me, what's really interesting is to think about the mix of solidarity and being a member of multiple communities. I've always struck me, people who think of liberalism as some notion of universalism, I've never thought that was right. Liberalism is actually what emerged when people sort of saw that they wore many hats at the same time, but shared some with almost everybody around them. So that's why I think you're right, you talk about being members of multiple communities, and that gives you options, all the kinds of options that Debra's talking about, but within each of your communities, you both care about everybody doing well and can perhaps accomplish more as a result. And that's the balance, right? And at least as a theory for liberalism, I think that makes more sense. Obviously, how that plays out in any given society will be conditional. So we have time, I think, for one last question. Let's.
Thanks very much. I guess my question comes back to a conversation we were having this morning about whether you think we could really shift to another kind of economic paradigm without also shifting to another kind of democratic paradigm, and thinking about building new democratic institutions that are not just centered around elections and the short-termism and the campaigns and all the various incentives that are designed into the system that we have, that we call democracy today, and that we can draw inspiration by bringing back actually some very ancient democratic practices like sortition, randomly selecting decision makers and creating structured spaces for deliberation that in many ways actually I think maybe would be the non-militaristic form of service actually, that people have a duty if they're randomly selected to perhaps spend the 10 days of deliberation towards a policy or legislative proposal that they're drafted to work on for that period of time. And we had a big divide this morning of whether these kinds of things like citizens' assemblies, should we shift real decision-making authority to them, or should they remain advisory at the peril of them being dependent on political will of the moment in time and not really shifting power?
So I guess all I'll say is, again, these paradigms are not just economics theories, and they absolutely include theories of democracy. And if you look at the shifts over time, they have all been accompanied by shifts in the way democratic politics ran. So, they go together. I mean, in the U.S. context, you can think the actual fight over political economy is over the vision of the U.S. Constitution and what kind of republic is it designed to create. And then you get very different regimes that include major changes in the political system. So again, I don't have a particular view about what the next form should look like. The dissolution in our politics is fundamentally a dissolution. The main institution that structured democratic politics for the last century was a political party, a certain form of it. And yes, you could have more than one party in some, there was a kind of trade-off. You could have many centralized parties or very few decentralized parties. If you had like very few centralized parties, you got tyranny. If you have too many decentralized parties, you get chaos. So there's all sorts of, but they were fundamentally similar structures, and that does not seem to be working. And one of the other things I think that we'll have to sort out as we go along with this will be what kind of structures will people accept that will also be part of their accepting whatever it is that the government is doing for, or however it's limiting them.
Yeah, it's a great question to finish on, and the concept here is social capital, which is people participating in a community, doing things together that bring them together. And the great advocate of that for his entire life has been Robert Putnam. And it's, for me, a very fitting thing to finish by recommending his last book, which is called The Upswing, which is a marvelous book full of examples of organizations, communal organizations, which brought people together. And because they were working together, then they gradually learned how to cooperate together and how to do things positively, way beyond voting. So a participatory democracy is a society that's rich in that social capital. And You know, some societies like Germany, half of the whole adult population is in one or more communal organizations. Why? Because the law and money has subsidized and encouraged this for years. In Britain, we've demolished these community organizations because the law's hostile to them and the money has been shriveled from them. So money and governance can either make community participation work well or work dreadfully. And that shows up finally in voting turnout. In Britain, voting turnout in local elections is around 20%. Nobody participates because the local government's nothing to do, and so there's no sense of community. In Germany, where you've got these subsidized Verein, turnout is between 65 and 85% in local elections. People participate because they're used to participating.
So
the upswing.
one thing I'm picking up on this idea that we don't have like the paradigm, or we don't have all the answers. I actually think experimentation is really important because there's so much that we don't know. We know what kinds of institutions are not working and something about why they're not working, but we actually don't know a lot about what would work better. And so having an experimental attitude about different forms of participation, different rules of the game, I think that's something that's very consonant with, trying to figure out, like, what is a better way to do things.
So let's thank the panelists and